Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a great day at the conference so far. My name is Rinaldi, and I'm going to be giving a talk, DevSecOps as a Culture with the Robot Framework. So, I'm a software developer at Seek Limited and within Australia. So, without further ado, let's get straight into it. So, firstly, I'll bring you through the agenda of how this talk is going to be structured. So, first, I'm going to talk about what is DevSecOps to get everyone a general understanding about what DevSecOps is. Afterwards, I'll be talking about how we can implement security at every step, which is essentially the essence of DevSecOps. Afterwards, I'll then talk about how we can design solutions for DevSecOps. Fourth, I'll then be talking a bit about how we can make documentation and plan for documentation and also write the necessary ones for test case suits as well. And finally, I'll then bring you through a case study of DevSecOps within the cloud with the Robot Framework. So before we get started, just gonna give you a bit of intro about myself as well. So again, I'm a software engineer, pretty much been active in the cloud for quite a while, been active in open source communities, and been also giving talks as well, particularly within cloud-based DevOps and project management, have been giving talks and pretty much active in the open source community for the past 5 years now. And also, as can be seen as well from the number of certifications I have as well, particularly, I really love validating my knowledge as well within AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud as well. And on the side, I also run meetups as well, run a couple as well within Melbourne, and also run hackathons. I do tech talks, and I'm also a VR tech enthusiast. So, what is the motivation behind talking about this at all? As in, why do we have to bother about even talking about security or DevSecOps as a general whole? So, the answer to that is in two different parts. So, firstly, the post pandemic has led to more breaches, especially given that more and more companies have followed cloud adoption. We have seen more companies slowly transition their workloads into the cloud and hence requiring more security measures to be taken. There are many breaches as of recent. Even in Australia, we've actually had quite a couple of major data breaches involving telecommunications providers and medical healthcare providers, pretty much with PI information, which, as can be assumed, would definitely cause an uproar. So often a lot of providers adopt the cloud, but they don't understand best practices or the culture that you have to essentially have before adopting it. And the other part of this is that it has just been very fundamental for security to be in every step of the way, which is the whole essence of DevSecOps. Because when we talk about adopting security into our organization, we have learned over time that it is not possible to essentially build your structure based on what your company has done just through delegating security to a security team only. You have to essentially make it part of your culture, make everyone responsible for security. And that's what DevSecOps intends to do, to be able to motivate it as a culture. And let's bring you through the DevSecOps framework. So the DevSecOps framework adopts the DevOps framework, but adds security as part of every particular step. So what you see here is the 6 phases of DevOps, but now you're seeing that security now plays a big role within it. We can see in every step, plan, build, test, monitor, operate, deploy. We also have security steps as part of each one. So as can be seen, in plan, for example, we now include threat modeling and change impact analysis as part of this. And within build, we then essentially can also include code reviews, put through some vulnerability scanning, and put through some software composition analysis. When we get to the testing phase, we then start to apply DAST or dynamic application security testing. Within monitoring, we then introduce tools such as SIEMs or vulnerability scanning tools, which can be many different tools really, like Datadog or any different tools as well. And also, afterwards, we then go into the operate phase, which is when we start collecting logs, do a bit of RASP and also patching as well, and organize our firewalls accordingly as well based on web applications. And afterwards, we then go to the deploy stage where we then perform pen testing, chaos engineering, and access and configuration management, which is a very fundamental part of every particular structure, especially within the cloud. So, how does DevSecOps really contrast with DevOps in general? We've talked about these two like quite a bit so far. So, the main difference is that DevSecOps encourages security as a shared responsibility. We want to not only have a security team in charge of security, but we want everyone across the organization to also be part of the security. We want developers as part of security. We want engineers as part of security. We want everyone as part of security. So that is the essential part of this and why it makes DevSecOps different from DevOps. And aside from that as well, it also adds stages to the lifecycle instead of shortening it. So the interesting thing about DevSecOps is that it includes more complexity to the stages that your code would need to travel from initialization to finish. And this is because we have a different goal. With DevSecOps, the main goal is security instead of efficiency, while it's vice versa for DevOps. So there is certainly a trade-off here, but overall, when creating a secure organization, we can't afford to take shortcuts. That's a given. So it makes complete sense. And as mentioned, if we start deploying code, we have to have security at every step with DevSecOps. So as can be seen, with the 5 different stages of deployment within code, we can actually see that there's actually integrations with security at every step now. So within a pre-commit stage, even when you're starting to just code up your code and just getting ready to put it through, we essentially will also include now ID security extensions, which essentially can help you check your code, includes coding practices, and also have a established peer review process as part of this. When we go to the commit phase, we then start to talk about things such as static code analysis, performing security unit tests, and also managing dependency management. When we get to acceptance testing, we then may essentially put through some cloud configuration and work with security acceptance testing in order to ensure that every particular acceptance test is done well. And when we get to production, we then start to perform more checks, such as configuration checks. We start to do pen testing, could be black hat or white hat. And finally, we then get to operations, which is where we automate most of our workloads. We then go into continuous monitoring. And the most important part of when we start to do this is that we also have blameless postmortems. Because although we make security as part of every culture, but we want to make it as part of every personnel in the organization to be in charge of, we don't want there to be blame associated when someone makes a mistake. That is crucial to making sure that the culture works out well. And within feedback mechanisms, within stand-up meetings, so essentially one of the biggest points that has been found, at least in my experience and what I've seen in a lot of industries as well, is that DevSecOps works very well with Agile. And that's why I've also always motivated as well the transition towards Agile. So as part of this, one of the biggest changes, if you're familiar with stand-up meetings, one of the most familiar changes towards this is essentially adding a question. What just one question to the 3 main questions you usually ask in your stand-up meetings as well, which is essentially just add a question addressing security concerns. So it could be something as simple as, are there any security concerns that has popped up recently or as popped up like in the previous day? So just something simple like that essentially can help you motivate more of a security awareness within your company, and also in general directly understand what needs to be done next. And it is also very nice if you could create a weekly summary of security wins and improvements. So this always motivates this aspect of career, a culture of security as well within your team and your company as a whole, because you can essentially motivate everyone to also keep track of and celebrate what they have like done well and what they still need to improve on as well. And this could be in many forms. It could be like in an email, giving all employees the summary rundown of what has been done well and what can be improved, and that keeps a visibility towards everyone as well, because that way everyone's keeping track of like what's happening. So there are 6 main phases of testing, which are planning, requirements, execution, testing, tracking, and update. So within planning, we set security rules where appropriate. We essentially put through some finding needs as part of requirements as well. We, as part of execution, we code and deploy based on developer needs. We test, which works on continual testing based on the framework that we've chosen, which is in the robot framework. Within tracking, we then start to use metrics to track our successes, and we iteratively update based on the solution as well, because it's certainly not a one-time solution. We need to continually update our framework, our DevSecOps culture, in order to ensure that it actually goes well. And this is just an example of how architecture based on the cloud would be set up, especially in particular for Azure. As we can see, for example, in this particular architecture, we're including security at every step. Within Visual Studio, starting from Visual Studio, when we start uploading code, committing the code to GitHub, we have a GitHub security dependent bot that checks for security dependencies and essentially other security risks, pushing it up to as part of CI/CD into continuous integration, continuous deployment. In continuous deployment, we push it up to app service staging and eventually app service production on Azure. And within continuous integration, we then push it up to where essentially Azure as well, where we pretty much build and test the code, but we also integrate Sonar Cloud and GitHub Security to also check if there are vulnerabilities with the application as well. We then push it up to Docker as well, where then there could be other third-party tools that integrate well with Docker that could essentially check for vulnerabilities as well before then pushing it up to the Azure Container Registry as well. So this is an example of including security at every step of the way. And as part of writing test suits, a very powerful tool that integrates well with the robot framework is called Arachne. So Arachne is a featureful, modular, high-performance Ruby framework that is aimed towards getting pen testers and administrators to evaluate the security of modern web applications. So essentially a powerful tool that can allow you to test through endpoints essentially. So particularly in this particular script, for example, we can essentially start a Docker instance and particularly start a proxy as well, and also target a particular endpoint as part of the proxy. So as part of this, we then authenticate into the Arachne and pretty much essentially try to set a particular token and essentially try to essentially see how it would respond if it would return our web service essentially as well eventually would then return an appropriate response based on our testing based on Arachne. And we can essentially automate code based on the robot framework as well for this because it integrates with robot framework as well. And Zap is another particular tool that is used as well for this particular purpose as well, especially when we want to test endpoints too. So example is that we can essentially write Zap code based on the robot framework. So automating tests, for example, in this case, we perform a spider scan, for example. As part of this, we essentially want to create a session within Zap. We can essentially try to create a spider scan endpoint, which we specify a variable as part of that. We specify the endpoint URL essentially as part of this. And we get the response. We get it as part of the endpoint, and we want essentially to return to the status goes to 100, and we want to see if it equals to that. So this is a very powerful way. Automating tests based on Zap and Arachne is a very powerful way, essentially, of testing our applications as part of this, and very, very fits well as part of the DevSecOps framework when we go into the production testing phase, which OS Zap really helps out a lot as well, particularly for this particular purpose. And as part of documentation for test suits, it's very important that you understand how you can document your code and how you can document your test suits as well. So you need to always set a particular structure that you want as part of your test suits. You need to document how your test suits will be structured and essentially put guidelines and what to include as part of each particular structure. I'm not going to be talking too much on this because there are already a lot of guides on this, but essentially just bringing this up because it is very, very important in order to establish when you establish a culture, to document these particular steps as part of your framework. And you also want to avoid documentation per test case, but instead use documentation only as a guideline. Just say, for example, this particular set of tests actually do this particular purpose. It is actually not really good when you document per test case. And aside from that, in general, document metrics as well that you want to use to keep track of how you essentially will work with different metrics as well. It's like different successes and different security measures as well that you would take. So another big part of this is also how you would run test suits as well within Azure. Well, Azure luckily can help you run robot test suits on the go as well. So essentially you can just put it through and essentially can just run through the robot scripts as can be seen here. So as part of this, you can put it in the CI/CD pipeline. You can essentially install the robot framework. And when you go to the building process, when you start to like build and you start trying to test the deployment itself, you can essentially try to run the robot scripts that you have made, and as part of this, run like Zap or Arachne or the other robot testing frameworks that you already have, which integrates as part of the DevSecOps lifecycle as well. And monitoring is also another big part of this. Usually, cloud platforms already have a lot of different monitoring tools, but there are a lot of monitoring tools as Opsgenie, which you can see over here as well. You can document, and it's very important as well to keep on track of this, which helps you also monitor your deployments and make sure that everything is all good. And in general, escalate where necessary as well. So building the culture of DevSecOps is comprised of three main things, which is we need to essentially put a big emphasis on training. We want to be able to orient security teams to be able to serve all and not just having security teams only dealing with security work and others not concerned with it. And essentially, it's very important to build advocacy from security senior devs. So a case study as part of one of my digital transformation initiatives was essentially there was one time where we particularly had a lot of particular tech debt, and essentially and as part of this tech debt, we essentially always depended as well on having security teams deal with security-based work. So we essentially at some point we essentially decided to go for a digital transformation initiative, which we established a proper enterprise architecture where we then started to see issue counts dropping and eventually having also better fitting for our agile test cases, use cases as well. And also it worked well with how we also plan our change management as well eventually. So some key takeaways are that put big emphasis on security training, manage your vulnerability well, make security part of your culture, investigate threats appropriately, and always monitor compliance as well as part of this. So that is all for me for now. I will open questions as part of the next step. And again, thank you so much for me. My name is Rinaldi, and feel free to ask me questions either after this or post of this session as well through my Twitter or LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me there as well. Thank you so much.